Are you ready for this week's announcement from Renegade University? Sure you are. So we have 2 webinars that are coming up in May that you should take if you're interested in big ideas. The first is my webinar on Plato's Republic, which is part of the Great Book series that we're launching at Renegade University. Go to renegadeuniversity.com and you'll see it on the front page, or click video courses on the left. The other is being taught by Stephen Kirshner, the absolutely brilliant philosopher from the State University of New York, who many of you know from his appearance on Unregistered. Stephen, in his 2-part webinar, will be presenting nothing less than the case against morality. This is going to be the biggest mind blower of all. Again, go to renegadeuniversity.com to enroll and to get more information on these upcoming webinars on the big ideas. I hope to see you in class soon. Thanks. This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. Over the last 10 years, my guest this week has devoted much of his life and his career to what is probably the most thankless project in American life that I can imagine. That is, demonstrating the innocence of Jerry Sandusky, who was convicted of raping dozens of boys and will probably die in prison. This is my interview with John Ziegler. I am joined from Camarillo, California, by a former guest of Unregistered, the great John Ziegler, the journalist who blew a lot of minds when you were on this show 2 years ago, John. It was 2 years, I think, almost to the day, actually. And still to this day, it's one of the most viewed, most downloaded, and certainly most talked about episodes in Unregistered history. And we've had 162 episodes. So I'm really glad to have you back on, because there's still much more to talk about with the Jerry Sandusky case. For those of you who don't know about this, John is the journalist who has been arguing for almost a decade, 9+ years, that Jerry Sandusky is innocent. And as you told me on the phone, John, when we first talked, and it's not even close. That's a John Ziegler quote. It's not even close that Jerry Sandusky is innocent. And you convinced me. You convinced a lot of the listeners of this show. You've convinced some other journalists, but you certainly have not convinced American culture. You certainly have not convinced lawmakers, policymakers, prosecutors, and all the rest. You are now launching a podcast on the case, on your work on the case. The first episode has been released, and that's one of the reasons we're back here again. But why don't you talk about sort of what's been going on since I last saw you 2 years ago, why you started the podcast. And, you know, when we last talked, you were very pessimistic. You were fatalistic almost. It was a bit depressing, man, I got to say, because to me, you were a man who had devoted this huge chunk of your life, your reputation on this, right? And had basically just suffered and been punished and been censured and criticized and worse. And you were very down back then, and no major media was covering it. I think Unregistered is the biggest media outlet that's covered this. So just talk about you for a second before we get into the case and the podcast. Like, what's your last 2 years? And it seems like you might be a little bit more upbeat now.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me back. And I believe, that's how we started. Our last podcast interview was, it's not even close. That's the most shocking part of this. And people will realize, if they haven't studied this case, that everything they were told is not true. It took me a long time to figure that out. It took me a couple of years myself. In fact, unfortunately, too long to figure that out, because I accepted too much of the conventional wisdom, stupidly, naively, as being true. But it's not even close. And as far as my own personal involvement, this has been the worst thing that's ever happened to me. In a rational world, this would be a career-making episode.
Right.
But we live in an upside-down world now, where everything literally is the opposite of the way it should be. And I've had some bad things happen in my life, but this is the worst. I've survived it.
Wow.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. As far as this podcast is concerned, it is an extraordinary endeavor. Regardless of what you think about the case or want to believe about the case, what we have done here is absolutely extraordinary. It is 19 extensive documentary episodes, the first of which has already been released. It's called With the Benefit of Hindsight. In conjunction with the release of the first episode, we have, in a remarkable act of transparency, also released about 17 hours of raw core interviews that we did for the podcast with key people. By the way, these are not all of our interviews, but they're the core interviews. They're the longest interviews. You can reference them all for yourself for free. Our website is Framing Paterno. That's for Joe Paterno, the former Penn State head coach that got destroyed in the collateral damage of the Jerry Sandusky investigation. Framingpaterno.com. And again, the podcast is called With the Benefit of Hindsight. And the reason I mention it in this context is that, to your point, I didn't want to do the podcast. I had spent, before we started this, about 7-8 years of my life investigating this. I had accumulated a ridiculous amount of evidence and content. I wanted to find some place credible to put this, but we could not do it. We went on so many meetings in Los Angeles. I lived just outside of Los Angeles, with documentary film people and TV people, and everyone always thought, wow, this is an amazing story and it seems credible, but we just don't have the balls, I'm paraphrasing, to do it. It's too toxic. And then there was a glimmer of hope when Malcolm Gladwell wrote a best-selling book called Talking to Strangers, in which he devotes a chapter of that best-selling book to this case. And he effectively, I don't know if you've read the chapter, but he effectively uses my work, which I was happy that he did. He and I had been in pretty extensive contact about this before he wrote the book, and I sent him all sorts of stuff, where he does several key things that have never been done in the mainstream media on this story, including he endorses one of the key components of my theory of what really happened here with regard to the date of the infamous Mike McQueary shower episode, which totally blows apart the entire media narrative. And when the Gladwell book came out, there was like a glimmer of hope that, okay, maybe something can change here, because now maybe a mainstream outlet has a fig leaf of cover. That's all they really want. Is they always want back coverage. They want to protect their backside, especially in this cancel culture environment, where they need someone to take the heat so they can say, well, Malcolm Gladwell did it, so it's okay for us to do it. And I have to tell you, I believe strongly, and it's not his fault, it's understandable, but Malcolm Gladwell greatly overestimated the impact that chapter was going to have. I think he thought naively that, John, I'm going to put that out here, and all of a sudden now all these journalists are going to start looking into this, and your work is going to get all sorts of coverage and traction. I said, Malcolm, that's not going to happen, because you're underestimating, to create a word. You're underestimating the level of investment that these people all have in this case. I've related what happened here to, Duke Lacrosse. There's a little bit of Theranos here. There's Jussie Smollett. There's Manti Te'o. I don't know if you remember that whole crazy story.
Yeah.
But all of those things were fixable because the news media, they didn't put all of their chips down on this. Okay. They put a few chips down on all those, and they were wrong. And the story of telling people how they got it wrong was actually kind of a good story. And it was okay. And no one's credibility got completely destroyed. It was just one of those, oops, we screwed it up type of thing. If this is wrong, and it is, trust me, and you've come to that conclusion, your listeners will do the same when they get into the story. If this is wrong, it obliterates everybody who touched it, because this was such a huge story breaking 10 years ago as we speak. It destroyed so many lives, and it's so wrong. And it, by the way, just to clarify on it's not even close. It should have been obvious to everybody from the beginning that this story was absurd, including myself. One of the only reasons why I went through with this, just to finish why I didn't want to do the podcast, I feel very much like as a defense mechanism, you say I'm fatalistic. It's kind of been a defense mechanism for me psychologically to be able to deal with the mourning process of how all my work on this and all this injustice is never going to be fixed. And I had gone through that process. I've related it kind of like, although thankfully it's not this bad, but if you lose a child, right? As a parent, you lose a child and you've accepted that the child is gone forever. And you go through that mourning process, and it's excruciating. And then someone tells you, "Hey, John, I got an idea. We can revive your child. There's a chance we can save your child if you go through all this pain and suffering and you relive it and you tell us about it on a 19-episode podcast. Maybe we can revive the child," knowing there's no chance of the child being revived, but also feeling like I got to do everything I can until there's nothing else to do. Because the major decision I had to make in this case, Thad, was that as I started investigating, just to review, I began this feeling like, okay, most of what we're being told has to be at least somewhat true. They can't possibly have gotten all this wrong. The part about Joe Paterno doesn't make a goddamn bit of sense. So I'm going to investigate the Paterno aspect of this. I'm going to presume Jerry Sandusky was at least some semblance of a child molester. Maybe some of the stuff is exaggerated. Maybe it's not all true, but it doesn't matter. He's a child molester. And it took me 2 or 3 years before I started to finally realize, and after having interviewed Sandusky in prison and talking to all the key players, and I suddenly realized this is ridiculous. This case is absurd. It didn't happen. And I had to make a decision. I'm in a very literally unique position here. I'm the only one that can know this truth, can figure this truth out. I'm the only one that has any chance of telling the rest of the world about this truth, because I'm literally the only one that has access to all the information. And I'm the only one with the balls to actually do something about it. So do I do something, or do I just go, you know what, to quote Spinal Tap, this is one of those crimes better left unsolved, really. Remember that the drummer, the deaths of the drummer in the movie Spinal Tap. Right. And I probably should have chosen the latter. My wife would have preferred me to choose the latter, trust me. But unfortunately, that's not my DNA. And so I kind of made this pledge, I will do anything and everything I can. And up until the 10th anniversary of this story, which in my mind is November 9th of this year. So we're putting out the podcast, which is an extraordinary piece of documentary work, over 19 episodes, probably over 18 weeks, once a week, because they're very extensive episodes. And then on November 10th of 2021, I'm done. Unless someone really major drags me back in, I'm done. So, and by the way, part of the reason why this podcast is so compelling is it works on so many different levels. One, there's the true crime element of it,
yes,
which is fascinating. Mm-hmm. But there's also the element of my personal journey in this, which is a fascinating personal journey. And I have a co-host on this podcast, which is amazing that she's agreed to do this. who is a female television sports anchor at the Fox affiliate here in Los Angeles, Liz Habib. And Liz and I have a very, very interesting relationship because we actually anchored the news together 30 years ago in Ohio, in a small market in Ohio.
Amazing.
And bizarrely, I was doing sports then. She was doing news. Now I do more news stuff. She's the sports anchor, and she's famous and I'm not. But she does a great job of kind of playing devil's advocate, asking the questions that the audience would want asked. And I purposely chose her and convinced her to be part of it. One, because she, as a reporter, had totally bought in at the beginning of this story back in 2011 that it was all true. She's also happens to be a University of Pittsburgh grad, and that's Penn State's big rival. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And she has a brother who played football at Penn State during this, the time period of Joe Paterno and Jerry Sandusky. So there's all sorts of elements of this that people are going to find fascinating. And the real story of what actually happened here is way more interesting than the fairy tale that we were sold. That's really, I think, one of the main reasons why people ought to listen to this. And by the way, also, some of this stuff is just incredibly entertaining. I mean, you're going to go on a roller coaster ride of outrage and anger and empathy for my plight. There's going to be hilarious moments of those crazy, stupid things that happened to me and what I did, all the mistakes I made. Liz and I get in numerous fights. I mean, there's hilarity in some of this story if it wasn't so serious. I mean, when we get into some of the stories that Penn State paid out money to, that people know nothing about. They know nothing about. We have exclusive information on who these men were, how much money they got, what the stories they were that they told. We're in the flat out comedy realm. Comedy, absolute comedy. So you're in for quite a ride with the benefit of hindsight.
Comedy, except that there's a man in prison, right?
A man in prison, but by the way, it's worse than that. Just to review, Joe Paterno gets destroyed and dies 2 months later, right after being the winningest college football coach of all time. And there are 3 esteemed Penn State administrators who have had their lives destroyed, 2 of whom were forced into pleading guilty to misdemeanors that they thought meant they weren't going to go to prison. But I could have told them that was a huge mistake in this case because none of the normal rules are in play here. They went to prison. By the way, we interview one of them, the first interview he's ever done, Gary Schultz, 4 hours of interviews, which again, you can find at framingpaterno.com exclusive. This ought to be on national television in prime time, but unfortunately it's with me in a podcast. Right. One of the pieces of news we break in that interview is that bizarrely, the 2 administrators that pled guilty to the misdemeanor spent their time in prison together because the guy who was running the prison felt bad for them and wanted to put them together. And also Graham Spanier, the former president of Penn State, is still fighting whether or not he's going to go to prison. He's in very bad health. This is now almost 10 years later. He did absolutely nothing. In fact, Malcolm Gladwell believes that this is the most obvious injustice of the whole thing. He's actually, I believe the quote is that Gladwell said, he is embarrassed to be part of a society that has done this to Graham Spanier. Graham Spanier had nothing to do with the story, and the law he was convicted on did not even exist at the time of the offense. And a federal court held that. The state appealed that ruling, and they got some cockamamie panel to say, no, we disagree with that ruling, even though the law didn't technically exist. I'm paraphrasing, didn't technically exist at the time. It kind of sort of did. It's good enough. But this is over a misdemeanor of a guy who has never done anything wrong in his life. He's near death, and the state of Pennsylvania is still trying to put him in prison. And he never even had a conversation with anybody in this case. He never had a conversation. And I mean, this is the level of insanity here. So it's not just Jerry Sandusky. And of course, there's also all the damage, I mean, done, the 130 some $million that was paid out to these accusers, the hundreds of millions of dollars in other payments that Penn State made to allegedly try to fix this, all the damage to reputation, an entire history, I don't know how many, but certainly well over 1 million people in the state of Pennsylvania effectively had their history destroyed. I mean, this was a point of incredible pride, the 50 years of the Joe Paterno reign in Penn State, and it gets wiped out as if it never existed, all for something that, by the way, because this whole case is upside down. My view on Joe Paterno is that not only did Joe Paterno do nothing wrong on behalf of Jerry Sandusky, one of the more shocking things to people who have not followed this real case is that the only reason Jerry Sandusky's in prison, or at least the main reason, is because of Joe Paterno. If Joe Paterno had taken a different tact and had been given better advice by his son, Scott Paterno, who's a big villain in all this, I believe that this entire case would have turned out very, very differently. So anyway, everything is upside down in this case. And I'm glad. And to your point, you're not the only person that's been convinced. I mean, I'm not delusional about how many people have been, but my record on people looking at this who are objective is almost 100%. I mean, of people who will look at this and go, okay, let me pretend I don't know anything. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, which is the name of the podcast, almost everybody goes, wow, okay, you're probably right.
Yeah. 6.5 years ago, I was in pretty serious psychological trouble. My anxiety and insomnia were essentially out of control, and I didn't know what to do because at that point, I had spent 10 years doing psychoanalytic psychotherapy, spending tens of thousands of dollars on it. I had taken multiple medications, multiple SSRIs, and at that point, none of this was doing me any good. Friends of mine had been telling me about meditating, and some of them had even told me about this app called Headspace, but I resisted for a long time. Thankfully, finally, I saw an ad. I saw an ad for a free 1-month trial to Headspace, which is what I'm offering you now. And I used it, and I'll never forget the first session. After 10 minutes of meditating with Headspace, it felt as if my very body chemistry had changed for the better. It was a remarkable transformation. And I have used the techniques taught to me by Headspace every single day since then. And there has been nothing better for my mental health. It's been better than all the therapy and all the drugs combined. And I'm offering this to you now. I guarantee if you go to headspace.com/renegade and use the free 1-month trial that's offered to you right now, you're going to find similar transformations in your life. Again, I guarantee it. Go to headspace.com/renegade for your free 1-month trial to the meditation app that really changed my life. Thank you so much. Yeah, let's talk about that. So you've encountered a lot of people. You've told the story to many people. You've presented the evidence that you uncovered, the facts that you found out, information that you've discovered. What pieces of the case that you've told people have been the most convincing to them? What have you found to be most persuasive? Like, if you had to write an executive summary, knowing what you know now about what has been most compelling to people you've told this to, what is it? What would you put in that executive summary?
Boy, that's a great question. And one of the funniest parts about the answer is that there are so many things that there's so many things that in a normal case would be the one thing people go, what? This blows apart my entire perception of it. I will say that if I had to do it in one sentence, there's different facts that fit in that answer for different demographics, but I would say that the one that makes most people go, what? Is that we have Jerry Sandusky's medical records, which which were never part of the trial, which is a whole story that we get into.
I forgot about that.
Right. And one of the things you're going to learn eventually in the podcast, I don't want to give too much away, but it's an important fact, and I know you know about it already.
Yeah.
Jerry Sandusky, at the time of the two of the biggest allegations, victim number one, Aaron Fisher, who's victim number one needs to be the whole case, because if you understand the timeline, he's the only accuser for 2 years. So Aaron Fisher has to be telling the truth. Otherwise, this whole thing is completely destroyed on its face. It doesn't even get out of the batter's box. And victim number 9, Sebastian Payton, who ended up getting paid almost $20 million in this case. During the time period of their alleged allegations, there is a notation in Jerry Sandusky's medical records where the doctor mentions that Jerry Sandusky has essentially no testicular matter. No testicular matter. Now, this matters on two fronts. Number one is that as a man in his 60s with low testosterone and effectively no testicles, any man knows that it is not possible to do most of the things that he is accused of doing. Okay, that's number one. But that's not, to me, the most important part of that. To me, the most important part of that is if you understand the full case. All right. These are not situations where Jerry Sandusky abused these boys one time and a hit and run, never saw them again, right? Where you could be so confused that you don't remember the details and you didn't really look at anything. No. Aaron Fisher claims at trial, although this is a grotesque evolution of his ever-changing story. He testified at trial that he had 100 episodes with Jerry Sandusky. If you have 100 episodes where you're forced to give oral sex to Jerry Sandusky and you never mention that oh, by the way, the guy has no testicles. It was super weird. There is no chance you're telling the truth. And we now, because we not only have the testimony of the 8 men, not boys, adult men who testified at trial, but we also have the settlement stories, which I've had exclusive access to. We have 37 stories where nobody has used the golden ticket of saying, yeah, by the way, the guy has no testicles, which is something that would be impossible. It's impossible. I mean, remember, infamously, the Michael Jackson case hinged largely, although this turned out to be inaccurate, which is important to point out, but you may recall that case hinged largely on the alleged identification of a distinguishing characteristic of Michael Jackson's genitalia. They hung the whole case on that. And here, nobody bothers to mention about Jerry Sandusky. So that would be one of the top 5, but I mean, one of the things that Malcolm Gladwell writes about, in fact, I think this is the title of the chapter, is the boy in the shower. The boy in the infamous shower episode, I figured out who he was. And his story completely blows apart the entire narrative. So the boy in the shower, who we've talked about extensively in the past and will in the podcast, his story is definitely in the top 5. But, it's almost hard to narrow it down because there are so many things. In fact, I think that actually harms Jerry Sandusky's appeal, which is a different issue. He's still appealing, which, by the way, and I think you know the significance of this. It is unheard of for a serial child molester to be appealing 10 years later. I have never heard of a case.
Right.
And by the way, here's a guy with no money. And he knows, he's naive, but he's not this naive. He knows politically there's no appetite for his appeal, especially in Pennsylvania,
right,
at all. And yet he's appealing now into the federal court. Now, none of that fits. And you know this very well. None of that fits with the normal child sex molester timeline. These cases all go exactly the same way. And they're horrible. But here's what happens. You get a parent usually who gets suspicious, they make an allegation, they get enough information to where they get a warrant, they get the guy's computer, they find child pornography. Then at that point, there's usually a plea bargain conversation. Very rarely do these things even go to trial. There's a plea bargain, oftentimes because these guys feel as if they have an illness, and some of them even want to be caught. And so these things go in a pretty standard order. You get an allegation contemporaneously, you get the pornography, you force a plea bargain, they go to prison, and that's the way it goes. That's not even close to what happened here. Right. And there's not a shred of pornography in related to Jerry Sandusky in this case. Not a shred of pornography, not an allegation of plying with alcohol or drugs or payments. I mean, my gosh, Dennis Hastert, the former Speaker of the House, I still don't fully understand that story. Years and years later, he pays hundreds of thousands of dollars to someone he, I guess, must have molested when he was a high school wrestling coach. And that ends up causing him to get into his legal troubles. There's nothing like that here. There's no payment. There's no. And how do you get heterosexual boys? No one wants to talk about this. How do you get These are all heterosexual boys, all of them. Right. How do you get heterosexual teenage boys to engage in this on multiple, as I said with Aaron Fisher, 100 times without alcohol, without drugs, without money, and no one says anything? We're not talking about 1952 here. Yeah. We're talking about the 2000s. All these guys, when they were kids, were taught in school, if someone does something to you, say something. I mean, and so none of this makes any sense. And it was all built on a narrative that Jerry Sandusky was somehow such a god, that these guys were so intimidated and so just wanted to be close to him that they put up with it. And I'm like, why? Wait, he's a former football coach during the time period of most of these key allegations. Former. And there's no more powerful word in the English language than former. All right. So you're no longer Jerry Sandusky, Joe Paterno's defensive coordinator. You're a goofy guy who runs a charity for at-risk kids who doesn't even drive a nice car. I mean, the victim number one was 5 or 6 years old the last time that Jerry Sandusky ever coached a football game. I mean, Aaron Fisher did not look at Jerry Sandusky as a god. He looked at him as a babysitter who got him free stuff every once in a while and took him away from his crazy mother. I mean, this is the entire narrative was based on a fairy tale. And before I give you, let you ask your next question, because I know I'm running on, but this is important. So much of this comes in the context of the child sex abuse scandal within the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church sets this all up. And it's so critical that these allegations occur before the church scandal, when I think the rules were a bit different, with regard to showering in public places with kids and that kind of thing, which is stupid and naive, but at the time period was not that unusual. And again, before the Catholic Church scandal, I don't think people were, especially in Happy Valley, Pennsylvania, were nearly as suspicious of people. But then they become public after the Catholic Church scandal. And so the media and a lot of the public automatically thinks, oh, we've seen this movie before. We even see the casting. Joe Paterno, Italian Catholic, he's the Pope. The administrators, they are the cardinals covering all this up. Sandusky's the pedophile priest. The Penn State football fans are like the Catholic parishioners looking the other way to protect their sacred institution. It all made such perfect sense. And by the way, it was such a great story during a very down period of time for the sports media. It happened in a perfect storm moment in November of 2011, where baseball had just ended, basketball was on strike, college basketball hadn't started yet, football was in its lull before the final stretch for the playoffs. November was a rating sweeps month at that time. ESPN jumps on all this for all it's worth because they've got nothing else to talk about, and it was a perfect storm of crap. And the truth, we never, the old saying, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on. That adage was built for this case.
I've been telling you for a year now about this great new company called Paloma Verde CBD, based in San Antonio, Texas, owned and operated by Carlos and Vanessa Abelar. I told you that they had a brick and mortar store a little more than a year ago, ready to go. It was beautifully appointed. I've seen the pictures. But of course, the lockdowns came and destroyed all of their investment in that store, and they had to start from scratch. I told you that they reached out to me to see if I could get the word out about their store, about their online store now, and I did. I started to tell unregistered listeners about Paloma Verde. And you not only listened, you started buying their products, in part because their products are excellent and I vouch for them and I use them every day, but also in part because we get unbelievable deals on CBD that we won't find anywhere else, only for us. 25% off every single product in the Paloma Verde store. 10% off if you join their mailing list, so that becomes 35% off your first order. And then they put together my 3 favorite products, which I've been telling you about for a year now, into what's called the Unregistered Combo Pack, also known for the cool kids as the Thad Pack. And that includes their fruit-flavored gummies, 10 milligrams of CBD in every piece of candy, because that's what it tastes like to me, 25 milligrams of CBD in every one of their soft gels. I use this like medicine every day, between 2 and 6 for me personally, depending on what's going on in my life. And then my favorite thing that I've been raving about, again for a year now, is their high potency, fast acting tincture. I put a few drops of this under my tongue and I promise you, I feel my anxiety melt away almost immediately. So again, go to palomaverdestore.com, use the discount code Renegade, get that 25% off everything deal, get that 10% off from joining their mailing list deal, get the unregistered combo pack for 33% off, make your body feel better, make your life better, and I really thank you. So weren't you raised a Catholic?
I was, actually. I grew up in Catholic school. I went to a Catholic high school. I went to a Catholic university, Georgetown University. So to be clear, I have no connection to Penn State.
You were a Notre Dame fan, right? On top of that.
Yes, boy, your memory is amazing. I was a Notre Dame fan because I was a good Catholic boy.
Yeah.
But I do think, and I don't know if this is where you're going, I think that in a lot of ways that I believe, and I don't believe in fate, but I believe that almost my entire background was built for me to be the guy to figure this case out.
Yeah, that's where I was going. Yes.
Okay. I mean, if you wanted to create a persona for someone who could figure this case out, you need someone with a sports background, a Pennsylvania background, a Catholic church background, a news background, a guy who's an expert in the news media, and who doesn't give a shit about being liked. That's the main thing. Someone who has enough money to live without ever working again, which thankfully is currently the case, and someone whose mother instilled in them that the truth matters and that you need to stand up for the truth when no one else will. And I'm not, look, I am far from perfect. Part of the reason I'm still on this case is I fucked up so many times. I feel guilt about why I wasn't able to fix this sooner. I should have been able to do a lot more damage. When I went on the Today Show twice in 2013 and 2014 in exclusive interviews with Matt Lauer, who, in an incredible strike of irony, is now one of my best friends, and who I've worked with on his situation because he now fully understands how
that's right,
how this works. So I'm not perfect. at all. But I was built for this case because I've got asbestos skin and I understand the culture. And speaking specifically with regard to the Catholic Church, I've dealt with the priests in in this culture. The number one thing people don't understand about the Catholic Church scandal is that almost all of it, not all, almost all of the Catholic Church scandal was gay priests targeting gay teenage boys or boys they perceived were going to be gay.
Correct.
That's the key to that scandal.
That's right.
Because then you get compliance. Then you get boys who not only see them as literally godlike figures, but to whom the acts are at least somewhat pleasurable.
Yes, thank you.
That's not what happened here. Yes. Jerry Sandusky is dealing with athletic, heterosexual boys who are 12, 13, 14 years old in an area of the country, central Pennsylvania, that might as well be rural Alabama when it comes to acts of homosexuality.
Yes.
It is an absurdity that these heterosexual boys were going, Mom, I want to spend another weekend with Jerry, but I'm not going to tell you why, because I really like, giving Jerry oral sex or getting butt fucked by Jerry Sandusky. I mean, any heterosexual male will tell you that that's obscene. And by the way, I, kind of as an aside, I've always felt that if I had been advising, and I wish I had been, Jerry Sandusky's defense, when this trial was going on, not that there was any chance of a fair trial because it was a joke, but if Jerry Sandusky, in my experience, had only middle-aged mothers of teenage boys on his jury, he would have been acquitted of all charges because mothers of teenage boys get this. They get the absurdity of the nature of this allegation. Men, because the homosexual thing makes their brains explode, a lot of men are not able to get through it. But because women do not have that immediate, oh my God, I'm going to get fucked up the ass, by a man, their brains don't explode like that. In my experience, that's the demographic that most understands the insanity of the allegations here. And it's not just, by the way, insane things happen all the time. But guess what occurs when insane things happen? Lots of evidence is left in the wake. And there's literally no evidence here. And in fact, I believe we've done the impossible, Thad. I believe that by the end, if people listen to this podcast with the benefit of hindsight, we have done the impossible. We have proven a negative. We have actually proven the case for innocence against all odds with the highest burden of proof you could possibly ever ask for. I believe we've achieved that. In fact, in the first episode, there's been people, and which I'm happy that they're doing, asking me questions about, a little detail here, a little detail there. And one of my standard responses, just wait. By the end of this, you're not going to be worried about the little details because you're going to realize none of the little details matter because this is all bullshit.
So let's get into it. Let's do the case. And it's a multi-part question here. So first of all, how many purported eyewitnesses and victims testified to having seen or experienced Jerry Sandusky having sex with boys? How many people were eyewitnesses?
Well, there was one witness, Mike McQuarrie, who was by far the most well-known incident in this whole situation. He is alleged
another assistant coach at Penn State.
He was another assistant coach. At the time, he was a graduate assistant, which is important because of what really happened here. But he's alleged, and his testimony is very misperceived. He alleged that he heard sounds that he interpreted as sexual slapping sounds. And he then says he looked through a mirror in the shower area where for a very few brief seconds, up to maybe 3 seconds, he had supposedly saw Jerry Sandusky physically close to a boy that he perceived, by the way, incorrectly, of being around the age of 10 years old. And that was later spun by the prosecution 10 years later as him witnessing a sexual assault. Well, when you get into the details of what McQueary actually said, even if you forget, my version of the narrative, even based upon what he said at trial, he never says that he witnessed a rape. In fact, we have an interview out right now, which you can find at framingpaterno.com, which I urge you to check out, with Franco Harris. Now, I don't know if you know who Franco Harris is, but Franco Harris is a football legend. He is the star of the literally was voted last year the greatest moment in the history of the NFL, the Immaculate Reception.
Yes. And
he was a Penn State legend, a big supporter of Joe Paterno. And if you meet Franco, as I've done many times, Franco is, one of the very few people in this story I have more respect for at the end than I did at the beginning. Franco and I are exceedingly close. And he doesn't agree with everything on this with me on this. He's much more concerned with Joe Paterno than Jerry Sandusky, although he believes Sandusky deserves a new trial because he strongly believes in due process and that there was no due process in that trial. But Franco Harris talks to us in great detail about doing something extraordinary. Because if you know Franco, you have to envision this scene. So they're at Joe Paterno's funeral, right? And Mike McQueary is there. And of course, McQueary is not being treated with a lot of warm fuzzies because it's being perceived that McQueary partially killed the guy, because of the way this story went down. And so Franco Harris, a man with enormous gravitas, comes over to Mike McQueary and confronts him about what the hell happened when he went into that shower. And I dare anybody to listen to our interview with Franco Harris and come away with the conclusion any different than what Franco's conclusion was, which was this guy did not see sexual assault. And I've likened this to, imagine Wonder Woman taking her lasso of truth and wrapping it around Mike McQueary, because Mike McQueary at Joe Paterno's funeral is not going to be confronted by Franco Harris and lie to his face. There's just no way in the football culture that that's going to happen. And Franco is positive in great detail. He remembers every word that was said. Mike didn't see a sexual assault. The prosecution manipulated his testimony to make it seem as if that was the only conclusion that could be made. And that's before we get into the whole date issue, which I believe in Malcolm Gladwell's book and in our first episode of With the Benefit of Hindsight, completely blows Mike McQueary's story apart. And I'm fascinated by the date issue because it's kind of a fun puzzle. And it has nothing to do with child sex abuse. That's partially why we started the podcast with the date issue, because I know that people don't want to talk about child sex abuse. It's icky, it's horrible, it's disgusting, and all that. But when you talk about the date, all you got to do is use your brain. And if we're right about the date, and if Malcolm Gladwell's right about the date, and if Gary Schultz is right about the date, and I know we are.
Can you summarize the date issue?
Yeah, here's the very short version, and it gets a little complicated. But I'm just going to give you the short version, and you can get the more detailed version in episode 1 of The Benefit of Hindsight. So this alone belongs in your list of things that make people go, what?
Yes.
So when all this happens back in November 2011, we're told that this horrible episode occurs on March 1st of 2002. That's the date. In fact, if you watch carefully, occasionally to this day, when people write about the story, they will still use the March 1st, 2002 date, which is frankly hilarious because even the prosecution ends up recanting that date. But that's the date. That's the date Joe Paterno goes to his death thinking was the day that ends up destroying him and everything he built over 50 years. That date is wrong. And I want to make this clear because I don't do a good enough job whenever I talk about this. When we get that March 1st, 2002 date, this is not Mike McQueary on a whim being woken up in the middle of the night. Hey, Mike, what date did this happen? And he goes, I don't know, March 1st, 2002. No, this is prosecutors and investigators having months to research this. This is an incredibly important fact before they go forward with the grand jury presentment. This is huge, right? This is not a oh, by the way sort of moment.
Yeah.
So when they go and say this happened March 1st, 2002, they're putting his credibility on the line, the credibility of their story on the line. And after Paterno dies, but before Sandusky's trial, they very quietly, and I'm sure they knew the news media would do their bidding for them on this, they very quietly go, when we told you it was March 1st, 2002, we now have documentary evidence that has adjusted our thinking on that. It turns out that Mike got the date, the month, and the year wrong. And this did not happen after 9/11. This happened before 9/11. It happened on February 9th of 2001. Now, when I read that first article, I'm like, what? Wait, we have just destroyed all these people's lives over one eyewitness who gets the date, the month, and the year of this catastrophic event totally wrong.
By 13 months. By 13
months. Right. He can't remember if it's before 9/11 or after 9/11, which in my mind was impossible. Right. It was impossible. Right. And I'm thinking, so this is the first moment that in this story that I'm going, oh my God. Oh my God. And I'm waiting for this to become a huge story, and people are so invested in their narrative that they go, oh no, he just didn't remember. And I'm like, really? Okay, shouldn't this at least raise questions? Well, this is where I screw up. Okay, This is my biggest mistake in the case. So when I interview Jerry Sandusky in prison, I'm still presuming that February 9th is the date. They can't possibly have screwed this up twice, right? There's no way they screwed this up twice. And the reason why we know it's February 9th is because we know via documentary evidence that Mike McQueary goes to see Joe Paterno the morning of February 10th of 2001. That's a Saturday morning. February 9th is a Friday night. And so the theory by the prosecution is Mike sees this on a Friday night. He's freaked out. He talks to his dad and his dad's friend, and then immediately the next morning, because he's got urgency, because you got to have urgency here. Urgency is everything. Yeah. He goes to see, not the police, he goes to see Joe Paterno. That was the narrative, and I'm like, okay, all right. That contradicts some of Mike's prior testimony, by the way, because of the way he described campus on the night of March 1st. And March 1st was the first day of spring break, and the prosecution used that as bum, bum, bum. Here, Jerry Sandusky thinks he has, the wide open locker room for his ability to rape children. By the way, I don't know why he doesn't decide to bring the kid to his house where he has a lot more privacy. Exactly. So he decides to take him to a semi-public or semi-private, depending on your perspective, very large locker room area where, there's no small encasings. The kid can run around wherever he wants to run around. It's a huge area. So this doesn't make a lot of sense, but okay. So when I interviewed Sandusky, I'm presuming he's guilty, Thad, but I'm open-minded, and I'm also realizing just because you're guilty doesn't mean you're lying about everything, right? I mean, you can be telling the truth about certain things and still be a child molester. And this is not my first rodeo. I've done a lot of very high-profile interviews, especially for someone who's not famous. And so, and it's just been a weird part of my career. So this is one of the reasons why I was perfect for this situation. So I'm in there for 3 hours plus with Jerry Sandusky. And if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was he did not believe February 9th was the right date. He didn't know what the right date was, but he kept saying, that doesn't make sense to me. And I knew he believed that. And I go out of there going, wow, okay. I need.
Wait, hold on a second. So Sandusky thinks it wasn't the right date for what? He never admitted to anything, did he? I mean, nothing.
No, he acknowledged that there was an episode that he was showering with this particular boy.
So there's no right date either for Sandusky. This is all made up, isn't it? Isn't that the point here?
Well, no, just to be clear, Mike McQuarrie did walk in and see Jerry in a shower with a boy. That did happen.
Oh, I see.
Whether there was the key is whether or not there was any kind of sexual assault that happened. And
gotcha.
and the reason why Jerry knew that this thing had been an episode was that Penn State asked him about it. And this is where the date thing becomes so key and so fascinating, because it has so many, it's like a ripple effect of injustice, the way this goes down. And it's a fascinating mystery and a puzzle. But so here's the short version. So one of the things Jerry had said to me was, I know who the boy was. He didn't tell me. I had to figure this out on my own. I know who the boy was, and I never would have taken him out of school in order for us to spend a day together. And I know we spent that whole day together. That's what he said to me. I know that. And so I figured out on my own who the boy was. Turns out his name is Alan Myers. His name is he's named in Malcolm Gladwell's book. He was the kid that was in the shower. I knew a lot about Alan Myers. I knew where he went to school. I contacted his school, and sure enough, he had school on February 9th. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. And I'm actually, just to give you, even though this was a huge mistake on my part, for people to understand where I'm coming from, I actually thought, is Jerry trying to pull one on me? Is he trying to concoct some sort of crazy thing where I will buy in to this theory? So because the Today Show interview was coming up and I had a ton of stuff to do, I tabled that stupidly. I tabled that investigation into the date again, partially because I thought there's no way the prosecution got this wrong twice. So years go by, and I'm always thinking there's something wrong with that date. That date just doesn't make sense. But how in the world could they have gotten this wrong twice? Well, thankfully, and this was not even my doing, but I have a lot of supporters who do their own research on this case. And I started to get sent things about February 9th that show there's no way February 9th was the date. For instance, Mike says this was a very quiet night on campus. He's clear on that. And on that night, across the street from the shower is a sold-out rock concert. And in the building where the shower is, at the very time in which this episode occurs, Penn State is playing a hockey game. So there is no possible way that it's February 9th. So what date is it? Well, Jerry had told me that he had spent the whole day with Alan Myers, and he had connected it to two major events in his life. One was that his book had just come out, and that he had lost out on the Virginia University head football coaching job. And so in his mind, those three things were all connected to this moment. Alan Myers not being in school, the Virginia head coaching job, and his book coming out. Well, we now have more than enough information to know that the actual date is December 29, 2000. The reason why we know this is that, by the way, that was a Friday night. But we have a newspaper article from the local paper that shows that Jerry Sandusky was doing a book signing in State College the morning of December 30th for his book. And that December 30th, that was widely reported, was the day that Virginia announced that Al Groh was going to be the next head football coach at the University of Virginia, after Jerry had done 4 interviews with Virginia and had a contract, was handed a contract to be the next head coach. If he signs the contract, we're not talking today. None of this happens. And we also know that there was a book signing the day before, early on the 29th in Washington, PA, where Jerry grew up, across the state from Pennsylvania. So now we have the narrative. Jerry takes Alan Myers to the book signing in Washington, PA. He drives all the way back to State College that evening. By the way, I've interviewed Jerry Sandusky's college roommate who called or had a conversation on the phone. I don't know who called who, but a conversation on the phone with Jerry on the way back because his son went to Virginia and he wanted an update on the Virginia head coaching situation. This guy's as straight as an arrow, was not lying to me at all. Remembered details of the phone call. And so we have this. So we now know that that's when he brings Alan Myers back. They have a workout in State College that night. They then take a shower. Mike McQueary, through a bizarre, mainly because Mike McQueary was bored out of his mind, because that was December 29, 2000. That's the quietest day you're ever going to find on a college campus.
Winter break.
It's winter break, and Penn State doesn't go to a bowl game that year.
Oh.
So Mike McQueary has had nothing to do for a month. And what I believe happened is he was watching the Peach Bowl on ESPN. That ends at around 8:30. He's bored. He decides, I've been watching football all day. I'll go over to the locker room and maybe get some work done. And he just happens to be there when Alan Myers is having a perfectly normal, although playful, whatever, they're playing some sort of stupid game in the shower because Jerry was a kid. Jerry was arrested state of development kind of guy, where he was still a kid in a lot of ways. He never had children of his own, had only adopted and foster kids. It is my personal opinion, based upon his medical records and my interaction with him, that he is an asexual person. I don't think that Jerry Sandusky even thinks of anything in a sexual realm, which is partially why he was completely confused by Bob Costas's question, are you sexually attracted to young boys, where he hesitates. And of course, the whole world goes, oh my God, he must be a pedophile, when I've always thought, even though I knew that answer was horrendous, wait a minute, we're supposed to believe this guy was a pedophile for 40 some years. He's gotten away with this, and he doesn't have a good answer for whether or not you're sexually attracted to young boys. If this is true, that's all he's thought about for the last 40, 50 years of his life. And he doesn't have a good answer for that. Well, the reason why he didn't answer properly, although he eventually does answer the question no, is because I don't even think his brain works this way. I don't even think he even thinks about it. I think it's complete. I think it was such a shocking question. What are you talking about? Sexually attracted to young boys? And so anyway, the bottom line of the date issue, which I completely screwed up and I have enormous guilt over, is that there's now 6 weeks from the time that Mike McQueary sees whatever he saw in the shower and when he goes to see Joe Paterno. That's not urgency. That's calculation. And your next question, I'm sure, will be, so why does he go to see Joe Paterno? What suddenly happens? And this is the key. And it's unfortunate that Malcolm Gladwell, for some reason, leaves this out of his book, because I'm sure to a lot of people, this is a gaping hole. Well, okay, why would Mike McQueary do this? Well, we know. Because there's a remarkable, quote unquote, coincidence that on the same night that history will show that Mike McQueary allegedly saw Jerry Sandusky molesting a boy in a Penn State shower, happens to be the same day that he finds out in the local paper that Kenny Jackson has left Penn State to go to the Pittsburgh Steelers, thus opening up the wide receivers coaching job, which is a graduate assistant Mike McQueary desperately wanted. And that's why he goes to see Joe Paterno the next day. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why he would go to see Joe Paterno under these circumstances and what he was trying to accomplish. And I have lots of theories about what it is, but I'm sorry, those two events are obviously connected, especially when Mike doesn't get the job at that time, which is what would have happened if there had been a cover-up. He gets that same job 3 years later when it opens up again. So it's the job he wanted, the job he thought he was qualified for. He eventually gets that 3 years later. And then one other important point on this date thing, which I kick myself, because there's no way Mike would not have remembered that this happened that week of March 9th as a graduate assistant. That year, February 7th, 2 days before, was National College Signing Day, which, especially in that era, was like Christmas Day for college football coaches, especially an assistant like Mike McQueary. His whole life is about recruiting and proving himself to get kids to come to Penn State. And that's the day you find out how you did. He would have been incredibly busy. He would not have been bored off of his ass, and he would have pegged that date as, oh my gosh, we were so busy, and I remember it well. We had just gotten off of college signing day, and then I saw Jerry Sandusky doing this to this boy who I didn't bother to help, and who I didn't beat up Jerry Sandusky when I saw this, which of course doesn't make any damn sense. But all of that would have been part of his memory, and it wasn't, because that's not the way it happened. He waited 6 weeks because it wasn't in his self-interest to make an issue of this until the job opened up the day before.
Okay. I'm thinking about incentives. You raised this motivation for McQueary. So I asked you, the original question was, how many purported victims and eyewitnesses have there been? How many other victims have testified that they were raped by Jerry Sandusky or had sex with him?
That's an incredibly simple but great question. At the time of Jerry Sandusky's arrest, okay, when the crap hits the fan, when the media tells us, oh my God, this is all true, and can you believe Penn State allowed this to happen?
2011? Is that 2011?
2011, in November of 2011,
right?
When the firestorm starts and the world collapses. Based upon my reading of the testimony, there are 2 men who claim sex acts with Jerry Sandusky. 2. Now, I will give the prosecution a lot of credit. They did an amazing job of smoke and mirrors to make it look like there was this avalanche of boys, not now adult men, who were claiming this. But what they did, it was clearly very cleverly calculated. They had 2 episodes, McQueary and the so-called janitors, where they have no victims. So people are presuming, oh, wow, okay, those are real. So there's somebody representing those 2 situations.
Quickly, what's the janitors episode?
Your mind's going to be blown on the janitors episode. I can't do that quickly, but here's the shortest version possible. As part of the grand jury presentment, the prosecution claims that there are janitors who will testify that they witnessed Jerry Sandusky, much like Mike McQueary, abusing a young boy in the Penn State locker area. That sounds incredibly damning, right? Especially when it backs up McQueary. Except when you find out that by the time we get to trial, Thad, and I'm not exaggerating this, a scintilla. This is mind-blowing. By the time we get to trial, the witness in that episode does not testify. He does not testify. The judge decides, you know what? He can't testify because he has dementia. And so therefore, I'm going to allow another janitor to testify that first janitor told him about this. Oh my God. It gets worse. It gets worse. It gets worse. That this other janitor told him, even though there was no contemporaneous report. And the prosecution claimed, well, we've got 2 janitors that this original janitor with dementia told. And so we're going to have both of them take the stand. Well, as it turns out, they only put 1 on the stand. The second one mysteriously never testifies after the judge approves the hearsay testimony. And then we find out, this is so mind-blowing. Then we find out, and this is unbelievable. This is, to me, an appeal issue that if it was a Dateline NBC, you'd automatically get a new trial. Guess what? We found out later that the defense knew about and never brought up. That the original janitor with dementia had been interviewed by investigators, which is weird if you think he has dementia, right? Why are you bothering to interview him if you think he has dementia? And in the interview, he says, not once, not twice, but 3 times that the man he saw was not Jerry Sandusky. 3 times. Now, what I believe happened is They interview the guy. He gives them the wrong answer, and they decide, well, thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Calhoun.
Right.
We're sorry about your dementia. Clearly you have dementia because you didn't give us the right answer.
Right.
And we are now going to have to rely on hearsay witnesses. So Jerry Sandusky got convicted at trial of 5 serious counts. The jury convicted on all 5 of these counts involving an episode with no witness, no victim, no date, and no contemporaneous report. I mean, I can't explain this case any more clearly than that. So, but at the time of the grand jury presentment, Thad, that's presumed by the media as, oh, that's a victim. There's a victim attached to that. So that was an allegation of sex. And Mike McQuarrie as a victim of allegation of sex, even though we haven't identified the boy there either yet, for reasons that will become obvious at some point. So those were counted in the minds of the media as 2 boys claiming sex, even though there were no boys attached to those. And then at the time of Jerry's arrest, there were 4 others who were claiming what I would refer to as acts of grooming or inappropriate touching or things that could at least theoretically be misunderstood. They were not direct sex acts. And what I think these guys were guys who were putting their toes in the water. Yeah. These were the guys that were like, boy, this is interesting. My lawyer's telling me this could be good for me. And so let me put my toe in the water here. Maybe I'm not going to put all my chips down on this, but I'm going to put a few chips down just to see what happens here. And by the way, 2 of those 4 we have exclusive information on this that will be revealed in the podcast. 2 of those 4, by the time trial comes around, they're still basically telling the grooming story. But when it comes time to get the money from Penn State and their lawyers tell them that Penn State is paying out based upon how bad your allegation is and how often it happened, voila! All of a sudden, now in the darkness of a private settlement negotiation, their stories change completely. One of my favorite lines from the thousands of pages of settlement documents that got leaked to us is that the lawyers for one of those 2 in his request for money says, I think this is a direct quote, "The full extent of our client's abuse was not elicited at trial." And I'm like, wow, the prosecution must have really found that to be astonishing information. So you're at Jerry Sandusky's criminal trial and you're testifying, but you're withholding the level of your abuse. That's asinine. So by the way, you've just admitted to perjury. You've just admitted to perjury.
Right.
But what's really happened, obviously, is that the lawyers have given them the notice, which was an important notice. It was true. They figured out that Penn State was paying based upon a formula, and in order to get based upon getting the really big bucks, you had to have horrible allegations of abuse. One of the many ironies in the settlement documents is there's one accuser of Jerry Sandusky who I believe basically told the truth at trial. He is victim number 6, and he's the so-called 1998 episode. And he exaggerated a few things because he was being manipulated by the prosecution, but by and large, he told the truth. And in fact, I believe if you read his testimony objectively, he sounds like a defense witness. Because he's saying nothing sexual happened. Jerry was awesome to me for all these years after this alleged thing happened. I thought of him as a dad. I sent him Happy Father's Day messages and Thanksgiving messages. I'm glad you're in my life and all this. And guess what happens at settlement? He gets almost no money. So the one guy that actually told, and when I say almost no money, he gets less than $2 million. The rest of these guys all get paid 6, 7, 8, 9, up to $19 million.
Wow.
Victim number 6 gets gypped because he didn't claim an actual sex act. And I believe he's the only one that was telling the truth. So to answer your original question, at the arrest, there are 2 men claiming clear sex acts. And then at trial, they add 2 more. Yeah. Victims number 9 and victims number 10, who come forward after the firestorm and after it's clear Penn State is paying a ton of money. Victim number 9, who I am told by people who witnessed this at trial, I was not at Sandusky's trial, I am told was the least credible of all the accusers. He's the one that's claiming, that Jerry raped him in the basement and he was screaming and Dottie didn't help him. And, his story is very different, frankly, than the rest of these allegations. And it's horrible, but it's also nonsensical. And especially if you've been in that basement. Matt Lauer went in that basement. And I know for sure Matt was like, are you kidding me? The basement is like 10 feet from the kitchen and you can hear everything. I mean, it's just an absurdity. I mean, the basement was portrayed as somehow this den of pedophilia. And it was just the normal basement for that you'd see anywhere. I mean, anyway, the point is he gets paid at least $19 million with this ridiculous story. And victim number 10, who also alleges a sex act, I am completely convinced never met Jerry Sandusky, never met him. And there's kind of a funny story that will give you a sense of who Jerry is and how honest he is to his own detriment. So when I got all the names of who got paid exclusively leaked to me, I sent the names separately to Jerry and Dottie Sandusky, his wife, because I wanted to separately, I wanted to see who did they think they knew and was the list consistent, right? Mm-hmm. And the list was remarkably consistent. They knew about half the guys that got paid by Penn State, about half. But there was one discrepancy. And one of the I think the only one that I can, at least that jives in my memory, the only discrepancy was Dottie said we had no idea who victim number 10 was. And Jerry indicated he did know who victim number 10 was. And I said, Jerry, you've always said to me that you never met Rittmeyer is his last name. You've never met victim number 10. And he says, well, I did meet him. I met him at trial when he testified. It's such a classic. I mean, you have to understand how naive and honest Jerry Sandusky is that he didn't want to tell me a lie because he actually had met Rittmeyer at his own trial when he was testifying against him.
God. He's a child, Jerry Sandusky, right? You've described him that way. Describe his personality.
He is very naive. He's very religious. Religion plays a huge role in this case in so many ways.
Catholic?
Protestant.
Oh, really?
Protestant, which actually causes this is not a huge part of the story, but I believe that there was a rift between the Paternos and the Sanduskys over the Catholic versus Protestant issue.
Oh, really?
Which did not help things, especially between Sue Paterno and Dottie Sandusky. But it plays a huge role in Jerry's view of the world, his naivete, his view that this is all going to work out, that these guys aren't going to be able to do this to me. He's not dumb. He actually writes to his own detriment because this ended up becoming evidence somehow in his case. He writes amazing letters. I have dozens of them. He's an incredibly good letter writer, but he is also exceedingly naive, partially because he was living until this happened a charmed life. Here was a guy who never dreamed of becoming a national championship assistant coach for Joe Paterno at his alma mater, Penn State, and then building this massive charity that was lauded as one of the great organizations in the state of Pennsylvania. And I think he believed in the system. I think all these guys believed in the system way too much. And so I am frustrated by Jerry Sandusky's personality, but I actually think that he is a good man, and I believe he's probably rationalized. I think on his deathbed, when he's about to die in prison, I think he probably feels as if his sacrifice has been worth it, because all these boys, these turned into men, that he loved, that they all got paid millions of dollars because of their interaction with him. Now, he's not happy about that, but I'm sure he's going to rationalize it in some way, shape, or form. I mean, he does have a little bit of a Christ complex, which I can kind of understand. I mean, at one point he which really bothered me after our interview, he did refer to me as Judas, which of course meant, I guess, he was Jesus. But I can certainly understand why he feels as if he's been crucified.
But you're on his side, though. Why would you be Judas?
Well, no, at that time I had gone on the Today Show, and I had been asked by Matt Lauer, and I did not want to answer this question. Because I didn't know. But Matt asked me 3 times, and I never expected to get asked 3 times. Is Jerry Sandusky guilty? Mm-hmm. And I tried to say this is not about Jerry Sandusky, this is about Joe Paterno twice before I finally said, I presume he's guilty of at least some of what he was accused of, although there were due process problems with the trial. That was my way of trying to not destroy the interview, because if I say Jerry Sandusky is innocent, and at that time I didn't know for sure, I had suspicions at this time, and I even told Jerry during our interview, Jerry, you've got no shot here. I mean, he still thinks that people are going to take a look at this. And so I thought the Judas thing was a bit harsh, but I'll tell you, the Judas thing had an impact on me in the sense of throughout this entire 10-year ordeal, I've never lost any sleep over what I had been doing until then. I lost sleep because of that letter. Not because I felt guilt over, oh my God, I owed him anything because he gave me an interview. It was because there is no level of consciousness of guilt there, right? I mean, if you have the audacity to think that you're a Christ-like figure and that I'm Judas because I didn't go on the Today Show and declare you innocent, that's extraordinary. By the way, speaking of lack of consciousness of guilt, another interesting thing, there were so many interesting things, but another interesting thing about that initial interview was that I sensed a real, disdain's too strong a word, but he had a lot of animosity, that might even be too strong, but something in the realm of animosity towards Joe Paterno. And that was very striking to me, because I'm like, if this is real, can we just put on our thinking caps here? If this is real, this is effectively an illness he has. And this illness destroyed Joe Paterno's life, right? And so the guilt that any human being would have over their actions having destroyed Joe Paterno would, at the very least, it manifests itself in sympathy for Joe Paterno's situation. There was none of that. And I found that to be quite striking from a human standpoint, because I'm like, how does that make any sense? He would feel so much guilt over what happened to Joe Paterno if this was real. But because he knew it wasn't real, and because Joe Paterno had actually, as I've already alluded to, played a pretty significant role in his conviction, then that's why there was some conflict there. And that was very telling to me. To me, the human side of this story tells you a lot about what really did and did not happen. It's not just about documents and testimony. I'm big into, how people react to situations. Like, for instance, how is it possible, Thad, that Jerry Sandusky is still married? How is it possible that Graham Spanier is still married? How is it possible that Tim Curley and Gary Schultz are still married? How is John Ziegler still married? None of us have gotten divorced during any of this, yet Mike McQueary is divorced. Aaron Fisher, victim number one, is divorced. His wife is part of this podcast, and says some very extraordinary things that you want to hear. Sarah Ganem, the reporter who got the Pulitzer Prize on this case. Pulitzer Prize. The story about Sarah Ganem was, oh my gosh, boy, you know, the media just love this narrative. This 24-year-old, apparently journalistic savant, this female who's a Penn State grad, takes on the evil child molesters at Penn State and brings them down single-handedly. And she wins the Pulitzer Prize. And she's a journalistic hero who then, let's wait for it, never writes a book about the case. Goes, which I think is huge, goes on to CNN, where she has unlimited resources. And this journalistic savant never breaks another story, and is now, as we speak, out of the business. Now, how is that possible? If Sarah Ganem is a journalistic savant at 23 or 24, how does she go to CNN and crap out? And literally, the only two things she's known for are giggling on the set with Wolf Blitzer during a story about abuse. Really? Ironically enough, and getting hit with a snowball while covering a snowstorm in the Boston area. That was her great contribution to CNN. I would suggest that if you understand anything about journalism, the alternative narrative of the Sarah Ganem is the only one that makes any sense. And that is, Sarah Ganem was used by the prosecution to put a Craigslist ad out for new accusers of Jerry Sandusky, because after 2+ years, they couldn't find any.
What?
That's what happened.
Craigslist. I didn't know about this. I forgot about this.
I'm using the phrase Craigslist.
Sorry. Okay.
I'm pejoratively describing her initial article as effectively, that's what this was. Effectively, this was a Craigslist ad in the local paper, because no one knew about it. You know, a grand jury investigation is supposed to be secret for good reason.
Gotcha.
And let's go back to your point about how many men had accused Jerry Sandusky of actual sex acts. How unbelievable is it that we're being told he did this for 40 years? In March of 2011, there's a front page news story telling everybody in the area that Jerry is under suspicion, telling every lawyer in the state, this is interesting. So the investigators now have the ability, armed with this break in the ice, this article in the newspaper, and this is what they do. This is not hyperbole. This is not speculation. This is what happened. They have a list of all these former Second Mile charity kids, and they can go interview every single one of them. They can go fishing in this pool of former at-risk kids who have horrible family backgrounds. Many were abused for real. Most are not in good marriages. Most are not in good jobs. Most need money. So now they get to go interview every single one of these guys for all these months, from the end of March to the beginning of November. And this is what they do. And all they find is one more person to claim a sex act against Jerry Sandusky. One! How is that possible? If what we're being told is true, what we're being told is true, the floodgates would, I think it's one of the great testaments to who Jerry Sandusky is, that's all they could find even after they did all that. Mm-hmm. It's amazing that only one threw him under the bus completely. And by the way, just to be clear on that one, there's an audio tape. This is unbelievable. There's an audio tape that they thought they had turned off during the interrogation of this particular accuser, victim number 4, accuser number 4. They thought they had turned it off. Where his lawyer, and by the way, why the hell does he have a lawyer in an interview as an accuser? You don't need a lawyer as an interview as an accuser. There's no need for a lawyer. But he has a civil lawyer, a guy who ends up making a mountain of money in this case because he ends up with multiple accusers. Oh. He says, can I talk to you? He says to the investigators, can I talk to you when we turn can we turn the recorder off and can I talk to you? They say, sure. They think they turn the recorder off, except they don't. The investigators and the lawyer, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is accurate. You can look it up for yourself. They then conspire to lie to his client that they have more accusers than they actually have in order to get him to start accusing Jerry Sandusky of a sex act, because he's not accusing Jerry Sandusky of a sex act. He's still doing the toe in the water type thing where, well, maybe Jerry did. I don't know. He's hemming and hawing. And the investigators tell the lawyer, sure, we do that all the time. Let's do it. Now they think all this is not on recording, but it's played at trial.
Right.
And the judge tells the jury, it's perfectly fine for you to take that tape into consideration, but it should only reflect on the credibility of the investigators, not the accuser himself. Because when they think they turn the tape back on, guess what happens? They do exactly what they conspired to do, and all of a sudden, victim number 4, the light bulb goes off. He now feels comfortable. See, this is so key. He feels like, oh, I'm not the only one. Jerry's going down, and I can get on this train. And by the way, just to prove this is not speculation, there's a scene in Aaron Fisher's book, which I urge anyone to read. If you read Aaron Fisher, victim number 1's book, is what convinced me of Jerry Sandusky's innocence. Okay. That was the final nail in the coffin. I've done a press conference outside of a Jerry Sandusky appeal where I literally gave copies of the book to members of the media. Please read the book. The book is that ridiculous. But there's a scene in the book where Aaron Fisher's therapist, Mike Gillum, who's a quack, who ends up losing his state contract over this whole situation, and because he helped write the book, he wrote a book which is completely unprofessional about his own client who was giving therapy to. So there's a scene in the book which I find to be key. Thad, you can tell me if I'm wrong. And it's Aaron is standing outside the courthouse. He's not yet given his testimony. And according to Gillum, another one of the Sandusky accusers comes to Aaron and basically says, if you read it like a normal human being, basically says, this really happened to you, right, Aaron? And Aaron says, oh yeah, it was terrible, And what's clearly happening is that this accuser is making sure Aaron is telling the truth. Because if Aaron's telling the truth, now it's okay for me to go ahead and give my testimony because I know I'm not the one that's putting Jerry behind bars for something that didn't happen to me. I'm just taking advantage of it. Well, who was that guy? Well, if you know anything about the case, we know that's victim number 4 because Mike Gillum's other client in this case was victim number 4. He's witnessing his 2 clients having a conversation before they give testimony to basically make sure the other one is telling the truth. Because if the one other guy is not telling the truth, then they're not going to go forward. You see where I'm going with this? Yep. And sure enough, victim number 4 ends up being the first guy to testify because the prosecution hilariously thinks that he's their star witness. And the prosecution team did only one interview in this case with Armin Katayan from 60 Minutes Sports. And to me, it was a key moment. I was like, oh my God, there's no way this case is real, because they went on and on about how victim 4 was their star witness. And I'm like, wait a minute. First of all, you didn't even mention about the tape involving victim number 4, which was a bombshell for the defense. But more importantly, you can't have any other star witness in this case other than victim number 1. Aaron Fisher because he's the only accuser for 2 years. If he's not the star, you don't have a case. Otherwise, what you're suggesting is that somehow, this is the theory that if Aaron's not telling the truth, that for 2 years you had a fake accuser that suddenly opened the floodgates for all these real accusers, which is insane. It's nonsensical, especially when there's no evidence of it. So anyway, I don't know if that's where you wanted me to go, but
no, it's great. So how many people got paid?
There's a little bit of confusion over that. I believe it's 37.
37.
We have documents proving 36 payments. What's really weird, there's so many weird things about the payments, and I think those are some of the strongest episodes of the with the benefit of hindsight podcast, and they come later on because we have all this exclusive information, and some of the stories are just hilarious. But one of the weirdest parts about the settlement process is it was almost like there was a going out of business sale. Some of the biggest settlements happened years after Jerry Sandusky's trial. And it's bizarre. And they are to people who I know are lying. There's a guy named Frankie Probst, and this sounds egotistical. I believe I'm responsible for some of these guys getting paid because 5 of them are from Lock Haven, Pennsylvania. Lock Haven, Pennsylvania is Aaron Fisher's hometown. It's the armpit of the universe. I've been there many times. And within Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, my work is very well known because everyone in Lock Haven knows Aaron Fisher is full of shit. And what I think happened is that people in Lock Haven realized, oh my God, if Aaron Fisher got away with this, there's free money here. And so these 4 other guys who were connected, one of them was not. One of them just made it up. But there were 4 other guys from Lock Haven who come forward with allegations to Penn State. They all get paid huge amounts of money. Frankie Probst, who his nickname was Frank the Tank because he was such a big kid. He played tight end on his high school football team. He played like 5 years of college football as a tight end. He was taller than Jerry Sandusky as a teenage boy. He gets interviewed by NBC as the allegations are hitting the fan, right? After the Paterno firing, I believe even it was after the Bob Costas interview. So Jerry is convicted for all intents and purposes. It's over for Jerry. And Natalie Morales does an interview with Frankie Probst in which I think I counted, and don't quote me on this, but it's in the podcast. She gives him like 16 opportunities to accuse Jerry Sandusky of something. And he never does. Never accuses him of anything. I don't even know why they interviewed him. But it was simply because he was known as someone that was close to Jerry Sandusky. So that was 2011, and late 2011. In 2000, I think it was 16 or 17, he ends up getting paid $7, $8, $9 million for being a Jerry Sandusky accuser after having given a national television interview as an adult after the shit hits the fan, being as clear cut as he could that nothing ever happened to him. And that's the level of insanity in this.
Wow.
And by the way, that's not even the most insane settlement story. This to me, the settlement stories are fun. I mean, even though it's tragic, some of these are just absolutely hilarious. I mean, and the one that ends up putting the final nail in the coffin of Joe Paterno, who HBO, in the Al Pacino movie, they made a big deal about this guy. Oh my God. I mean, completely fraudulent story. And by the way, Sarah Ganim ends up vouching for this guy in a way that should have destroyed her career then at CNN. There's just so many elements of the settlements. We even have an interview from the guy who paid the settlements, Thad. We have an interview with the guy who was not done by me. It was done by our purposely fake accuser who went on a 3-year sting operation to expose all this and came up with amazing stuff on the number one lawyer and therapist in the case. But we have an interview with Ira Lupert, who was the chairman of the board of trustees at Penn State, who effectively gave out all this money, saying that he believes that many of the accusers were on the gravy train. That's the word. That's just his words, gravy train, and that they were exaggerating. And I think he even said some of them might not have been real, but we had to pay them out. He also refers to Paterno and the 4 administrators as great men who simply made a mistake. Well, if that's the case, then why are you not making that clear to the public?
Right.
And why are you not making it clear to the public that the media has latched onto this 1971 cockamamie story involving Joe Paterno that's just ludicrous as the final nail in his coffin? Why aren't you correcting that? And and there's because there's a whole sort of series of agendas behind the scenes, and we have interviews with 2 former members of the Penn State Board of Trustees who go into great detail about his involvement in this and why they believe Jerry Sandusky is innocent. And these are very credible people, very well known, very successful, very connected to every single person in the story. And they're just one of many people that now know, with the benefit of hindsight, that this story is just not true.
You're relentless and ferocious, aren't you? You just will not let go of the bone. You're a dog with a bone, aren't you?
Well, Dad, maybe I'm just stupid. I'm definitely stubborn. If there was somebody else, I think I told you this before, if there was somebody else willing to take this, I would have been happy. Here, take all my stuff. In fact, I tried many times. Take all my stuff. I don't even care about credit. It doesn't matter to me. I just want this goddamn thing fixed okay. I guess at this point, I've put so much into it, and people might think, well, is he just so invested because he's had so much damage in his own life and put so much time and effort into this that he just doesn't want to see reality? And I would say to those people who might be thinking that, it's exactly the opposite. I wanted Jerry Sandusky to be guilty. I would have been dancing. I would have been dancing if somewhere along the lines in the last 7 years, someone had come to me and said, John, Jerry is guilty. Let me show you why. Here's the evidence. I would have been like, please, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, I've only had, and this is, I'm a big believer in the absence of things happening is oftentimes more impactful than actual events occurring. I have been contacted by, I don't know, it might be in the hundreds of people with information about the accusers saying, this didn't happen. This guy is a fraud. No way. I am exceedingly well known within the community of these people.
Sure.
Why have I not gotten anything from the other side? Not one person. There's only one mom of an accuser, not even a trial accuser, a settlement accuser. Only one mom ever contacted me and said, John, I used to love Jerry, but I think you got this wrong. And I said, great, let's talk. And so I call her that night and we spent like 3 hours on the phone. And by the time the phone conversation was over, not only was I totally convinced her son was not abused, I had convinced her son was not abused. And I said, can we talk again? I want you to go talk to your son. And she said, I will, John, I will. And we set up a time where we were going to have a second conversation. And of course, what ends up happening, we set up that time, she disappears. She's gone. And her son has been paid millions of dollars. And I am led to believe that the mom has benefited from those millions of dollars. And it's amazing how that will alter your perception of things. But no one would be happier if someone came to me with any shred of evidence of guilt of anybody in this case. And at this point, it's not going to happen because if it was going to happen, it would have happened already. And I would just leave by saying, in the opposite direction, if I was so wrong, right, on a case like this, I mean, this was effectively Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? I mean, these were as big a nuclear bombs on the foundation of this case as you could possibly ever imagine. If I was so wrong, how less than 10 years later am I able to grow anything on this field that's been blown apart by 2 nuclear bombs? Exactly. And not only am I not, I haven't just grown, a couple of weeds. I have grown a forest, a forest of credible information to make up a 19-episode podcast involving credible people with documented evidence. That would not be possible. I mean, I would have to be insane, but also a genius, but also stupid enough to not use this genius for my own self-interest, because this has not helped me in the least. I don't know how many jobs I've probably lost out on, how destroyed my career is permanently by this, how much money I've lost out on this. And by the way, the case itself has cost me money. This podcast will probably end up costing me money in the end, who knows? But I mean, and other people money, by the way. So somehow I'm able to get other people to spend money on this to produce it. I must be an insane, evil genius who's also stupid. Of course, the Occam's razor analysis would be, no, I'm just right. And no one has a self-interest to accept that. Although I will say, to this day, there are still a couple of mainstream news outlets that claim that they are doing investigations on this and claim that they will eventually be doing stories on this. Now, I have gone through that rodeo before where, we thought we had the cover of Newsweek, and that blew up at the very last moment out of cowardice and circumstance. And there's been a couple other episodes similar, but, I'm not giving up total hope until November 10th of this year. And at that point, I'm hoping this will, I'll finally be able to bury this, but at least there'll be a record of what really happened, because this case was too important for there not to be a record of the actual truth. The truth has got to matter. And the truth of this case is exceedingly clear.
Last question. So you've put in a decade of work on this, as I said earlier. You've now come out with a whole bunch of new information and evidence in the podcast to add to your already monumental work on this. You seem far less depressed than you were 2 years ago. You even seem slightly upbeat here. I think I might have asked you this 2 years ago. Let me ask it to you again in light of these new developments in sort of basically your life. Do you think Jerry Sandusky will ever get out of prison?
Oh, no. Yeah. Oh, no. I mean, I think he has a chance in a federal appeal, because a federal court is unelected and doesn't give a rat's ass about the people of Pennsylvania or the media of Pennsylvania. He had no chance in Pennsylvania. I mean, Pennsylvania, the entire establishment of the state was literally invested in his guilt. Right. But I don't think there's enough years. I don't think he's going to live much longer. I mean, he survived COVID, which I found to be interesting, because, for a while there, I thought this story has to end with Jerry Sandusky dying of COVID. That's the only way this story can properly end. Right. I mean, his spirits are remarkably good. They're probably better than mine. I'm glad you think my spirits are good, but I'm just I'm just more accepting of reality now. But no, he will die in prison. And I would like to believe that there's still a chance that maybe 15 years from now. I think 15 years from now, on the 25th anniversary of this story, there's a chance someone might go, maybe we got this one wrong. And the reason I say 15 years is, at that point, first of all, this is key. All the news media members who were critical in the original narrative will be gone. Mm-hmm. So that's incredibly important. Mm-hmm. Incredibly important that everybody in the news media that was influential at the time in 2011 will be gone. That's number one. Number two, in 15 years, these accusers are all going to be in middle age and have kids. And I would like to believe a few of them might grow a conscience at some point.
Yeah.
And that would potentially change things. But it's not going to happen in time for Jerry Sandusky to get out of prison, in my opinion. Now, he, in a rational world, a federal court would look at the trial, even if Jerry Sandusky was guilty. Even if it was guilty, they would look at this trial and they go, "What the flying fuck was this?" I mean, the janitor story alone would be, right. What the flying fuck is this? And there are, and in my opinion, there's too many of these issues. I mean, there's so many issues. I mean, there's Brady violations all over the place. They lied to the jury that the identity of victim number 2, the boy in the shower, was, quote, known only to God, when they knew that wasn't the case. And not only that's nonsensical. This case has been worldwide attention. How do you not know who the boy in the shower is? Well, they knew who the boy in the shower was. They just didn't want him to testify because they didn't like his story. So I don't believe that Jerry will get out of prison. Obviously, I wish that he would. And as soon as he dies, the chances of this ever being fully fixed are over, because then there's no court case. And it's only in a court of law where there's really only two places where the truth can come out in this day and age: a court of law, maybe, and a podcast, because that's the only place where you have the time to actually get into the level of detail. And we've gotten people who complain, well, boy, your episodes are really long. Well, I'm sorry, when you give me a burden of proof that is, at the ceiling, it takes time to be able to reach that level of burden of proof. But you can't get into it television is just lost as far as the truth is concerned, especially in a case as complex as this and with such a burden of proof. And radio, even, you can't do it on radio. I mean, radio is all commercials now, so it's really only podcasting. So, and I would just say this is the last thing, that yes, the true crime element is part of why people should listen to, with the benefit of hindsight, but it's what you're going to learn about humanity that is the real reason. I have learned so much about the true nature of humanity from my involvement in this case. I almost feel like it's given me an unfair advantage in interpreting other cases now, where, and not just court cases. I'm talking about, like, I knew the COVID thing was going down exactly the way that it did, because I knew that, and people have even told me this, oh my God, the two situations are so similar, from a narrative standpoint, where you have a bunch of media experts latching on to a narrative in a panic, and then they don't want to admit they were wrong. And so now they have to double, triple, and quadruple down. Okay. It's an incredibly similar dynamic. Well, I knew immediately we were toast. As soon as here in California we locked down, I'm like, that's it, it's over. There's no going back, because now they're going to have to justify having done that. And to be clear, COVID is real. This case is not, but the reaction to it is actually remarkably similar. And you're going to learn, you're going to understand when you listen to this podcast, you're going to understand those dynamics. And I'm sure this is not the last time this is going to happen. I mean, we've seen it happen in other situations, that we just haven't, they didn't get as much publicity as this one. And some of them were corrected because the media didn't put as many chips down on them.
With the benefit of hindsight is the name of the podcast, right? And one episode, correct. One episode has been
episode number 1 is out. By the time this is out, I believe episode 2 will be out, which is about the panic, which will remind people a lot of the COVID situation. Great. You can get it on Apple iTunes and Spotify And I urge people to go to framingpaterno.com to check out all those raw interviews that we released with the debut of the podcast.
Awesome. Framingpaterno.com is John's website where you can find everything with the benefit of hindsight's the name of the podcast. Definitely check it out. I've listened to it. What's been released so far, it is top notch. John, you are a great journalist. That's the last thing I want to say to you. You're just a great journalist. That's it. That's what you are.
Thanks. I do appreciate it. That won't pay any bills, but I appreciate it.
I know. It's the shittiest job of all, but you just are. And I don't think anyone would disagree with me. John, thank you for doing this. And I will see you in 15 years.
Okay. I hope to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Ted.
All right. Bye-bye. This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To join the new Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. To join the new Unregistered Underground, the supporting listeners group for the podcast, go to unregisteredunderground.com. Thanks for listening.